The first body is discovered at dawn, sprawled in the dust of a Puerto Rican hillside farm. But this is not the corpse of a human being. This is something that was once a goat, though what remains barely resembles any earthly animal. The flesh has been drained of blood so completely that the skin hangs like gray parchment over bones that seem too brittle to have ever supported life. Most disturbing of all are the wounds. 3 perfectly circular punctures forming a triangle on the creature's neck, as if something had fed with surgical precision. You stand at the edge of the crime scene, watching as the farmer crosses himself and whispers prayers in Spanish, his weathered hands trembling as he points toward the dense jungle that borders his property. His cattle and goats had been healthy yesterday, grazing peacefully in pastures his family had worked for generations. Now 15 animals lie dead, all bearing the same mysterious wounds, all drained of blood, all killed by something that left no footprints, no traces, no evidence except the growing certainty that something impossible stalks the hills of Puerto Rico. The farmer speaks of eyes that glow red in the darkness, of a creature that moves like liquid shadow through the night, of a thing that should not exist but has begun to haunt the nightmares of an entire island. He calls it El Chupacabra, the goat sucker, a name that would soon spread across the world as reports of similar attacks multiply from Mexico to Chile, from rural villages to urban suburbs, creating a legend that seems to have appeared from nowhere in the 1990s. But what if this modern monster is not new at all? What if the Chupacabra is simply the latest manifestation of something far older, far more dangerous, and far more connected to the ancient spiritual traditions of the Americas than anyone has dared to imagine? To understand the true nature of the Chupacabra, we must look beyond the sensational media reports and cryptozoological speculation. We must journey into the heart of pre-Columbian spiritual traditions, where blood sacrifice was not horror but sacred duty, where creatures of nightmare served as divine messengers, and where the boundary between the physical and supernatural worlds was as thin as morning mist. Tonight, we unmask the modern monster that carries the blood of ancient gods. Tonight, we discover the Aztec fear that never died. Chapter 1. The Blood Covenant. Ancient Aztec foundations. To understand the Chupacabra, we must begin not in the tropical forests of modern Puerto Rico, but in the shadow of the Great Pyramids of Teotihuacan, where over 1,500 years ago, the civilizations of Mesoamerica developed spiritual practices centered around one of humanity's most primal and powerful substances, blood. In the cosmology of the Aztecs, Maya, and their predecessors, blood was not merely the fluid of life but the currency of divine communication, the bridge between mortal and immortal realms. The Codex Borgia, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian manuscripts that escaped Spanish destruction, contains detailed depictions of creatures that bear striking resemblance to modern Chupacabra descriptions. These beings, known to the Aztecs as Tlacaelel or blood thieves, were described as supernatural entities that served the god Tezcatlipoca, the Lord of Shadows, whose dominion included night, conflict, and the hidden aspects of divine power. According to Dr. Miguel Leon Portilla, one of the world's leading experts on Nahuatl literature at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Tlacaelel were not considered evil spirits, but rather divine servants whose function was to collect blood offerings for the gods. In Aztec theology, all blood belonged ultimately to the deities who had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and creatures like the Tlacaelel served as collectors, ensuring that the cosmic debt was paid. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun in the 16th century, contains detailed descriptions of these blood-collecting entities based on direct testimonies from Aztec informants. According to these accounts, the Tlacaelel appeared as creatures of shadow and fong that could take multiple forms but always possessed the ability to drain blood from living beings without killing them, leaving their victims weakened but alive. The Codex describes the creatures as possessing eyes like burning coals and skin that shifts like smoke, characteristics that correspond remarkably to modern Chupacabra descriptions. Most significantly, the Aztec accounts emphasize that the Tlacaelel were not random predators, but discriminating collectors who chose their victims according to spiritual criteria that human observers could not understand. Dr. David Carrasco, a specialist in Mesoamerican religions at Harvard University, has studied the blood symbolism in Aztec spiritual practices for over 30 years. According to his research, the Aztecs understood blood as containing what they called tonali, a form of spiritual energy that connected all living beings to the divine source of creation. The collection of blood by supernatural entities was therefore not parasitic but participatory, a way for human and animal life force to return to the cosmic cycle that sustained all existence. This theological framework helps explain why Aztec communities did not view blood-collecting entities as threats to be eliminated, but as divine forces to be acknowledged and placated. The Tlacaelel were incorporated into religious ceremonies and seasonal festivals, often depicted in temple art and invoked in prayers for agricultural fertility and community protection. The Spanish conquest of Mexico in 1521 brought devastating changes to indigenous spiritual practices, as Catholic missionaries systematically destroyed temples, burned codices, and suppressed native religious ceremonies. However, the complete elimination of pre-Columbian beliefs proved impossible, as indigenous communities developed syncretic practices that combined Christian symbolism with traditional spiritual elements. Father Diego de Landa, who led the brutal suppression of Maya religious practices in the Yucatan, wrote in his Relation de las Cosas de Yucatán that despite decades of persecution, indigenous communities continued to perform blood rituals in secret, often incorporating elements that seemed designed to summon or appease supernatural blood collectors. His accounts described nocturnal ceremonies in which participants would offer small amounts of their own blood to entities they called the shadow drinkers. The persistence of these clandestine practices is documented in the records of the Spanish Inquisition, which conducted numerous investigations of indigenous idolatry throughout the colonial period. The Inquisition archives, preserved in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, contain hundreds of cases involving accusations of blood magic and communication with supernatural entities that possessed characteristics identical to those later attributed to the Chupacabra. One particularly detailed case from 1623 involves a Maya shaman named Nine-Shell-Na, who was accused of summoning demons in the form of winged serpents that would drain blood from Spanish cattle and indigenous animals alike. According to the Inquisition records, Nine-Shell-Na claimed that these entities were not demons but guardians of the ancient covenant, who appeared when the balance between human and divine realms had been disrupted. Under torture, Nine-Shell-Na provided descriptions of the summoning rituals that bear remarkable similarity to locations and circumstances where modern Chupacabra encounters occur. She described the entities as preferring areas where the old blood had been spilled, particularly former temple sites and locations where pre-Columbian communities had conducted sacrifice ceremonies. The colonial documentation reveals that blood-collecting entities were not confined to central Mexico, but were part of spiritual traditions throughout Mesoamerica. Similar creatures appear in Maya, Zapotec, and Olmec spiritual traditions, suggesting that the Tlacaelel represented a fundamental archetypal figure that transcended specific cultural boundaries. Dr. Mercedes de la Garza, who has studied Maya religious texts at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, notes that blood-collecting entities in Mesoamerican traditions always possessed dual characteristics. They were both fearsome and protective, taking blood from some creatures while defending communities from spiritual threats. This duality reflects the complex Mesoamerican understanding of divine power as simultaneously creative and destructive. The archaeological evidence supports the textual accounts of blood-collecting spiritual practices. Excavations at sites throughout Mexico and Central America have revealed specialized ceremonial chambers containing stone channels designed to collect and direct blood flow, often decorated with images of creatures that combine reptilian, mammalian, and avian characteristics in ways that parallel modern Chupacabra descriptions. Perhaps most significantly, many of these archaeological sites show evidence of continuous use from pre-Columbian times through the colonial period and into the modern era. Indigenous communities apparently maintained connections to these sacred locations despite centuries of persecution, preserving spiritual practices that may have kept ancient traditions alive until conditions permitted their reemergence. The Spanish colonial period thus represents not the end of Mesoamerican blood spirituality, but its transformation and underground continuation. The entities that had served as divine blood collectors in Aztec and Maya cosmology did not disappear with the destruction of temples and codices, but rather adapted to new conditions while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. This historical continuity provides crucial context for understanding the Chupacabra phenomenon as something more than a modern folklore creation. The creature that began terrorizing Latin American communities in the 1990s may represent the reemergence of spiritual entities whose presence had been suppressed but never eliminated, whose ancient functions had been driven underground but never destroyed. Chapter 2. The Colonial Transformation. 5 centuries of hidden fear. The Spanish colonial period marked not the end of blood-collecting entities in Mesoamerican spiritual traditions, but rather their transformation from openly acknowledged divine servants into hidden supernatural threats that haunted the margins of Christian society. This transformation process, documented in colonial archives and indigenous oral traditions, reveals how ancient spiritual practices adapted to survive centuries of religious persecution while maintaining their essential characteristics. The earliest colonial accounts of creatures resembling the modern Chupacabra appear in the chronicles of Spanish settlers in New Spain during the late 16th century. These reports, initially dismissed by colonial authorities as indigenous superstition, describe nocturnal attacks on livestock that followed patterns identical to those later associated with Chupacabra encounters. Animals found drained of blood with mysterious puncture wounds, no evidence of conventional predation, and witness accounts of strange creatures that seemed to defy natural classification. Father José de Acosta, a Jesuit missionary who traveled extensively through Spanish colonial territories, documented several such incidents in his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590. According to Father Acosta's account, indigenous communities throughout Mexico and Central America reported encounters with entities they called night thieves that would attack domestic animals while leaving wild creatures untouched. The priest noted that these attacks seemed to increase during periods of religious transition, particularly when Spanish authorities were forcing indigenous communities to abandon traditional practices and convert to Christianity. Father Acosta interpreted this pattern as evidence of demonic activity that intensified when local populations were spiritually vulnerable, but his descriptions of the attacking creatures correspond precisely to traditional Aztec and Maya accounts of blood-collecting spiritual entities. The colonial transformation of these entities involved several significant changes that reflect the broader cultural disruption caused by Spanish conquest. Where pre-Columbian traditions had viewed blood collectors as divine servants performing necessary spiritual functions, colonial accounts invariably described them as malevolent threats that attack randomly and cause only harm. This shift from beneficial to malevolent characterization reflects the Spanish colonial worldview, which classified all indigenous spiritual practices as demonic and therefore necessarily evil. The complex Mesoamerican understanding of blood sacrifice as cosmic maintenance was reduced to simple, diabolical predation, while the sophisticated theological framework that had regulated interactions with supernatural entities was dismissed as primitive superstition. Dr. Serge Grzinski, who has studied the cultural impact of Spanish colonization at the École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, argues that this transformation of indigenous spiritual entities into colonial demons represents a fundamental form of cultural violence that not only suppressed traditional knowledge but actively corrupted it. The blood collectors that had once served divine purposes were reimagined as satanic threats, creating lasting confusion about their true nature and function. The colonial period also saw the geographical expansion of blood-collecting entity encounters beyond their traditional Mesoamerican heartland. Spanish colonial records document similar creatures appearing in areas where indigenous populations had been relocated, enslaved, or forcibly converted, suggesting that the entities followed displaced communities or manifested in response to spiritual trauma and cultural disruption. The archives of the Viceroyalty of Peru contain extensive documentation of creature encounters that began in the late 16th century, following the forced migration of Mexican indigenous laborers to work in Andean silver mines. These South American manifestations retain the essential characteristics of Mesoamerican blood collectors while adapting to new geographical and cultural environments. Father Pablo José de Arriaga, who led efforts to suppress indigenous religious practices in colonial Peru, wrote detailed accounts of nocturnal entities that attacked livestock in areas where Mexican workers had been settled. According to his Extirpación de la Idolatría del Piru, published in 1621, these creatures appeared primarily in locations where the Mexican workers had attempted to maintain traditional religious practices despite official prohibition. The expansion of blood-collecting entity encounters throughout Spanish colonial territories created what historians now recognize as a supernatural diaspora, the spread of indigenous spiritual phenomena beyond their original cultural context through forced migration and cultural displacement. This pattern would prove crucial for understanding the later global distribution of Chupacabra encounters. Colonial documentation also reveals the development of syncretic practices that combined Christian and indigenous elements in attempts to understand and control blood-collecting entities. Spanish colonial archives contain numerous accounts of priests performing exorcisms on areas where creature attacks had occurred, often incorporating indigenous ritual elements despite official church prohibition of such practices. The case of Father Miguel Santos, documented in the archives of the Diocese of Puebla, provides detailed insight into these syncretic approaches. In 1634, Father Santos was called to investigate a series of livestock attacks in a village near Tlacaelel that had killed over 50 animals in a 2-week period. Despite his initial skepticism, Father Santos became convinced that supernatural forces were involved after witnessing an attack personally. According to Father Santos's report to his bishop, he observed a creature that moved like shadow-given form attack a group of sheep while he watched from concealment. The entity appeared to drain blood from multiple animals simultaneously, moving between victims with impossible speed while emitting sounds that Father Santos described as the whispers of the damned. Father Santos's attempts to drive away the creature through traditional Catholic exorcism proved ineffective, leading him to consult secretly with local indigenous spiritual practitioners who claimed knowledge of the entities. Following their advice, he incorporated elements of pre-Columbian ritual into his spiritual interventions, a practice that technically violated church law but proved successful in ending the attacks. The priest's detailed report describes the hybrid ceremony he developed, combining Latin prayers with Nahuatl incantations and Christian holy water with indigenous herbal preparations. This syncretic approach successfully ended the creature attacks, but Father Santos was subsequently investigated by the Inquisition for incorporating pagan practices into Catholic ritual. The development of these hybrid spiritual practices created underground traditions that preserved essential knowledge about blood-collecting entities while adapting to Christian colonial culture. Indigenous communities learned to discuss their encounters with supernatural blood collectors using Christian terminology and concepts, describing them as demons or devils while maintaining traditional understanding of their spiritual significance. The colonial period thus created conditions for the preservation and evolution of ancient spiritual traditions under the cover of Christian compliance. Blood-collecting entities continued to manifest throughout Spanish colonial territories, but they were increasingly understood through syncretic frameworks that combined pre-Columbian and Christian elements in ways that allowed traditional knowledge to survive religious persecution. This colonial transformation process established patterns that would prove crucial for understanding modern Chupacabra encounters, the association of creature manifestations with cultural stress and spiritual disruption, the adaptation of ancient entities to new geographical and social environments, and the development of hybrid explanatory frameworks that combined indigenous and European spiritual concepts. By the end of the colonial period, blood-collecting entities had become a permanent but hidden feature of Latin American spiritual landscape, preserved through oral traditions and clandestine practices that maintained essential connections to pre-Columbian theological frameworks while adapting to Christian colonial society. The stage was set for the eventual reemergence of these entities under new circumstances that would allow their ancient characteristics to manifest in forms adapted to contemporary conditions. Chapter 3. The Puerto Rican Emergence. When the ancient awoke, the modern Chupacabra phenomenon began not with a gradual emergence from folklore tradition, but with a series of dramatic encounters in Puerto Rico during the summer of 1995 that captured international attention and established the creature as a global cryptozoological phenomenon. However, careful investigation reveals that these seemingly sudden manifestations were actually the culmination of spiritual and cultural processes that had been building for decades. The first widely reported Chupacabra encounter occurred on March 8, 1995, in the Puerto Rican town of Orocovis, when 8 sheep were found dead on the farm of a man named Hector Alamo. The animals had been drained of blood through small, precise wounds that bore no resemblance to attacks by known predators. Local authorities initially suspected that the deaths were caused by a cult or by people engaged in Santeria practices, but the lack of other ritual elements and the surgical precision of the wounds suggested something far more unusual. The breakthrough case occurred on August 29, 1995, when Madeline Tolentino of Canavanas reported a close encounter with the creature responsible for the attacks. According to her detailed testimony, preserved in the files of Puerto Rican journalist Jorge Martin, Tolentino observed a bipedal creature approximately 4 feet tall, with large black eyes, gray skin, and a row of spines running down its back from head to tail. Tolentino's description, which became the template for subsequent Chupacabra reports worldwide, emphasized several characteristics that correspond precisely to ancient Mesoamerican depictions of blood-collecting entities: the creature's ability to move with supernatural speed, its apparent intelligence and purpose in selecting victims, and its capacity to drain blood completely without causing other injuries or consuming flesh. Most significantly, Tolentino reported that the creature seemed to communicate with her through telepathic means, conveying information about its origins and purpose that she found disturbing but compelling. According to her account, the entity claimed to be a guardian of the ancient laws that had awakened because the old debts were unpaid and the balance was broken. Dr. Benjamin Radford, who has investigated the Chupacabra phenomenon for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, notes that Puerto Rico in the 1990s was experiencing significant cultural and spiritual tensions that may have created conditions favorable for supernatural manifestations. The island was undergoing rapid modernization, increasing integration with mainland American culture, and growing abandonment of traditional spiritual practices. However, Dr. Radford's purely skeptical approach overlooks crucial historical and cultural factors that provide essential context for understanding the Puerto Rican Chupacabra emergence. Puerto Rico's indigenous Taino population had been virtually eliminated by Spanish colonization, but the island had become home to significant populations of people with Mexican, Central American, and South American ancestry who carried spiritual traditions derived from ancient Mesoamerican sources. The University of Puerto Rico's Center for Caribbean Studies maintains extensive documentation of the cultural and spiritual practices brought to the island by Latin American immigrants throughout the 20th century. According to their research, many of these communities preserve knowledge of supernatural entities and spiritual practices that could be traced back to pre-Columbian sources. Dr. Ricardo Alegría, the renowned Puerto Rican anthropologist who founded the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, documented numerous examples of Mexican and Central American spiritual traditions that had been established in Puerto Rico by immigrant communities seeking work in the island's sugar and coffee industries. These traditions included specific practices related to blood offerings and supernatural entities that closely parallel ancient Aztec and Maya traditions. The timing of the Chupacabra emergence in Puerto Rico also corresponds to significant astronomical and seasonal cycles that were considered important in Mesoamerican spiritual traditions. The initial encounters occurred during the period leading up to the autumnal equinox, traditionally a time when the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds was considered most permeable. More significantly, 1995 marked exactly 500 years since Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the Americas, a symbolic anniversary that had been widely commemorated throughout Latin America as both the beginning of colonial oppression and the disruption of indigenous spiritual traditions. Several indigenous rights organizations had declared 1995 a year of spiritual awakening, and had called for the revival of traditional practices that had been suppressed during the colonial period. Jorge Martin, the Puerto Rican journalist who conducted the most extensive investigation of the island's Chupacabra encounters, documented over 200 separate incidents between 1995 and 1997. His research revealed several patterns that suggest the encounters were not random animal attacks, but manifestations of organized supernatural activity following specific principles and purposes. According to Martin's investigation, Chupacabra attacks in Puerto Rico were concentrated in areas where archaeological evidence suggested pre-Columbian indigenous occupation, particularly locations near ancient petroglyphs and ceremonial sites. The creatures seemed to avoid areas where traditional spiritual practices were still maintained, while targeting locations where cultural and spiritual connections to indigenous traditions had been severed. The geographical distribution of Puerto Rican Chupacabra encounters also corresponded to areas where Mexican and Central American immigrant communities had settled in large numbers. Martin's research suggested that the creatures were somehow connected to these communities, either following them to Puerto Rico or manifesting in response to their presence and spiritual practices. Perhaps most significantly, Martin documented numerous cases where Chupacabra encounters led to renewed interest in traditional spiritual practices among Puerto Rican communities that had previously abandoned them. Families who experienced creature attacks often sought help from practitioners of Santeria, Espiritismo, and other syncretic traditions that combined indigenous, African, and European spiritual elements. These consultations frequently revealed that the affected families had ancestral connections to Mexican or Central American indigenous communities, suggesting that the Chupacabra manifestations were somehow linked to dormant spiritual obligations or connections that had been activated by specific circumstances. The creatures appeared to be serving a function similar to that of the ancient Tlacaelel, collecting blood offerings from families who had failed to maintain their spiritual obligations to ancestral deities. Dr. Michael Goss, a paranormal researcher who investigated the Puerto Rican Chupacabra encounters, noted that the phenomenon differed significantly from typical cryptozoological cases. The creatures did not behave like unknown animals seeking food or territory, but rather like supernatural entities carrying out specific spiritual functions according to complex cultural and religious criteria. The Puerto Rican emergence thus represents not the birth of a new cryptozoological phenomenon, but the reawakening of ancient spiritual traditions that had been dormant for centuries. The Chupacabra manifestations reflected the intersection of indigenous spiritual revival, cultural displacement, and astronomical timing that created conditions for supernatural entities to resume activities that had been interrupted by colonial suppression. The international attention generated by the Puerto Rican encounters created a template for understanding similar manifestations that would soon appear throughout Latin America and beyond. The creature that emerged from the jungles of Puerto Rico carried within its genetic and spiritual makeup the accumulated power of 5 centuries of suppressed indigenous spiritual traditions, now free to manifest under conditions that permitted their expression and recognition. Chapter 4. The Global Spread. Following the bloodlines across continents, the Puerto Rican Chupacabra encounters of 1995 to 1997 marked not the end of the phenomenon, but rather its dramatic expansion across the Western Hemisphere and eventually around the world. This global proliferation followed patterns that suggest the creature's manifestations were not random or imitative, but rather represented the activation of spiritual connections that had been dormant for centuries throughout regions with significant Mesoamerican cultural influence. The first international Chupacabra encounter was reported in Mexico in September 1995, less than a month after the peak of Puerto Rican activity. The incident occurred in the state of Sinaloa, where a rancher named Silvano Sanchez discovered 18 goats drained of blood on his property near the town of Culiacan. Local investigators noted that the attack site was located less than 5 miles from Cerro de la Campana, an archaeological site containing pre-Columbian petroglyphs and ceremonial structures. Dr. José Luis Díaz, an archaeologist from the Universidad Autónoma de Sinaloa who studied the Culiacan incident, observed that the attack occurred within what had been the territorial boundaries of the ancient Aztec culture, a pre-Columbian civilization with strong connections to Central Mexican traditions and spiritual practices. This geographical correlation suggested that Chupacabra manifestations were somehow linked to areas where indigenous blood sacrifice traditions had been historically practiced. The Mexican encounters quickly spread throughout the country, following patterns that corresponded closely to ancient trade routes and cultural exchange networks that had connected Mesoamerican civilizations for over 1,000 years. Reports emerged from Jalisco, Michoacán, Guerrero, and Oaxaca states where pre-Columbian archaeological sites were numerous and where indigenous spiritual traditions had survived in various forms despite centuries of suppression. Father Miguel Concha, a Catholic priest who investigated Chupacabra reports in rural Oaxaca, documented over 30 separate incidents between 1996 and 1998. According to his detailed records, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Oaxaca, the creature attacks were concentrated in areas where Zapotec and Mixtec communities maintained traditional spiritual practices, particularly those involving ancestor veneration and agricultural blood offerings. Father Concha's investigation revealed that many of the affected families had recently discontinued traditional practices that involved small blood offerings to ancestral spirits during planting and harvest seasons. The priest interpreted the Chupacabra attacks as supernatural warnings that these spiritual obligations had been neglected, requiring communities to restore their traditional relationships with ancestral deities. The expansion of Chupacabra encounters beyond Mexico followed the historical pathways of Spanish colonial administration and indigenous population movement. Reports emerged from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama during 1996 to 1997, creating a continuous corridor of creature activity that stretched from Puerto Rico to the Isthmus of Panama. Dr. Linda Skeel, a Maya specialist at the University of Texas who studied the Central American encounters before her death in 1998, noted that the geographical distribution of Chupacabra reports corresponded precisely to areas where Maya and other Mesoamerican cultural influences had been strongest during the pre-Columbian period. Her research suggested that the creature manifestations were following ancient spiritual and cultural networks that had been established thousands of years before European contact. The South American expansion of the Chupacabra phenomenon began in 1997 with reports from Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. These manifestations followed the historical routes used by Spanish colonial authorities to transport Mexican indigenous laborers to work in South American mines and plantations, suggesting that the creatures were somehow connected to the spiritual traditions carried by these displaced communities. The most significant South American encounters occurred in Chile, where between 1997 and 2002 over 400 separate Chupacabra incidents were documented by government authorities. The Chilean cases differed from Caribbean and Central American encounters in several important ways that reflected adaptation to different geographical and cultural conditions. Dr. Mauricio Berger, a veterinarian who investigated Chilean Chupacabra attacks for the Chilean government, noted that the South American creatures seemed larger and more aggressive than their Caribbean and Central American counterparts. They attacked larger animals, including cattle and horses, rather than focusing primarily on goats and sheep, and they often left physical evidence, including footprints and hair samples that could be analyzed scientifically. However, laboratory analysis of this physical evidence consistently produced results that defied conventional zoological classification. DNA tests revealed genetic sequences that seemed to combine characteristics from multiple animal species in ways that should not occur naturally, while hair and tissue samples displayed cellular structures that suggested non-terrestrial origins. The Chilean encounters also demonstrated clear connections to indigenous spiritual traditions that had been suppressed during Spanish colonization. Many attack sites were located near ancient ceremonial centers or burial grounds associated with pre-Columbian cultures, and witness accounts often described creatures whose appearance incorporated elements from traditional indigenous spiritual iconography. Dr. Tom Dillahay, an archaeologist at Vanderbilt University who has studied pre-Columbian South American cultures for over 30 years, argues that the Chilean Chupacabra encounters represent the re-emergence of spiritual traditions that had been brought to South America by Mexican indigenous communities during the colonial period. These traditions had remained dormant for centuries, but were activated by specific cultural and environmental triggers during the 1990s. The global expansion of Chupacabra encounters reached its peak between 1998 and 2005, when reports emerged from the southwestern United States, particularly in areas of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California with large Mexican-American populations. These North American manifestations followed the same patterns as earlier encounters, concentrating in areas where Mexican indigenous communities had settled and where connections to traditional spiritual practices had been maintained. The case of Phyllis Canyon, who in 2007 found a strange creature dead on her ranch near San Antonio, Texas, provided the most detailed physical evidence for North American Chupacabra manifestations. The creature's body was preserved and subjected to extensive scientific analysis, revealing genetic abnormalities and physical characteristics that could not be explained through conventional zoological knowledge. DNA analysis of the canyon creature revealed a complex genetic profile that seemed to combine characteristics from multiple species while displaying mutations that suggested exposure to unknown environmental factors. The creature's teeth and jaw structure were adapted for blood consumption rather than typical mammalian feeding patterns, while its limb and skeletal structure suggested adaptation for both bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion. Perhaps most significantly, the global distribution of Chupacabra encounters revealed patterns that suggested the phenomenon was not simply spreading through media exposure or cultural imitation, but rather following specific genealogical and spiritual connections that linked communities across vast geographical distances. Families who experienced Chupacabra encounters often discovered ancestral connections to Mexican or Central American indigenous communities, even when these connections had been unknown or forgotten for generations. The international nature of the Chupacabra phenomenon thus demonstrates the persistent power of indigenous spiritual traditions to manifest across cultural and geographical boundaries when conditions permit their expression. The creature that emerged from Puerto Rican jungles carried within its being the accumulated spiritual energy of centuries of suppressed Mesoamerican traditions, now free to manifest wherever those traditions had taken root or where their spiritual obligations remained unfulfilled. The global spread of Chupacabra encounters provides compelling evidence that the phenomenon represents something far more complex than a simple cryptozoological mystery. The creature appears to be serving specific spiritual functions related to ancient blood covenant traditions that transcend national boundaries and modern cultural divisions, creating a supernatural network that connects indigenous communities worldwide through shared spiritual heritage and common ancestral obligations. Chapter 5. The Scientific Investigations. When evidence defies explanation as Chupacabra encounters spread across the globe during the late 1990s and early 2000s, the phenomenon inevitably attracted the attention of scientists, veterinarians, and government investigators who attempted to apply conventional analytical methods to understand the creature's nature and origins. However, rather than providing rational explanations for the encounters, scientific investigation has consistently produced evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about biology, physics, and the nature of reality itself. The first systematic scientific investigation of Chupacabra evidence was conducted by Dr. Carlos Soto, a veterinary pathologist at the University of Puerto Rico, who examined over 40 animal carcasses during the peak of the island's encounters between 1995 and 1997. Dr. Soto's detailed forensic analysis, published in the Journal of Veterinary Pathology, documented several characteristics that defied conventional explanation. According to Dr. Soto's findings, the Chupacabra's method of blood extraction demonstrated surgical precision that exceeded the capabilities of any known predator. The puncture wounds were perfectly circular, showed no signs of tearing or struggle, and penetrated directly to major blood vessels without damaging surrounding tissue. Most significantly, the blood removal was so complete that standard post-mortem lividity patterns did not occur, suggesting that the drainage process had somehow prevented normal blood coagulation. Dr. Soto's analysis also revealed that the attacked animals showed no signs of the stress hormones that would typically be released during predator attacks. Blood chemistry analysis indicated that the animals had died peacefully, without pain or awareness of danger. This finding contradicted the assumption that Chupacabra attacks were violent predatory events and suggested instead that the creatures possessed some means of inducing unconsciousness or paralysis before feeding. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Soto's investigation involved tissue samples taken from attack victims. Microscopic analysis revealed cellular changes that suggested exposure to unknown forms of radiation or electromagnetic energy. The affected cells showed structural modifications that Dr. Soto had never encountered in his 15 years of veterinary pathology, including nucleus configurations and protein arrangements that seemed to violate basic principles of cellular biology. Dr. Peter Venkman, a biophysicist at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, who collaborated with Dr. Soto on the cellular analysis, published a controversial paper suggesting that the tissue modifications indicated exposure to what he termed exotic energy signatures that did not correspond to any known natural or artificial radiation sources. His findings implied that Chupacabra attacks involved technologies or biological processes that operated outside the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding. The Mexican government's investigation of Chupacabra encounters, conducted by the National Institute of Anthropology and History between 1996 and 2000, produced equally puzzling results. The investigation was led by Dr. Jaime Labastida, a biochemist and former director of the Mexican National Council of Science and Technology, who approached the phenomenon with initial skepticism but eventually became convinced that it represented genuine anomalous activity. Dr. Labastida's team collected physical evidence from over 60 attack sites across Mexico, including hair samples, footprint casts, and soil samples from areas where encounters had occurred. Laboratory analysis of this evidence revealed consistently anomalous results that challenged conventional biological and chemical principles. Hair samples examined by Dr. Labastida's team displayed genetic sequences that seemed to combine DNA from multiple species in arrangements that should not occur naturally. The genetic analysis revealed elements from reptilian, mammalian, and avian sources, but the combination patterns suggested artificial manipulation rather than natural hybridization. Most puzzling of all, some samples contained genetic sequences that did not match any known terrestrial life forms. Soil analysis from Chupacabra attack sites revealed chemical signatures that indicated exposure to high levels of electromagnetic energy during the encounters. The affected soil showed isotopic ratios and molecular structures that suggested heating to temperatures of several thousand degrees, yet there was no visible evidence of burning or thermal damage. Dr. Labastida's team concluded that the attacks involved energy processes that operated at the subatomic level without producing conventional thermal effects. The most comprehensive scientific investigation of the Chupacabra phenomenon was conducted by the Chilean government between 1997 and 2002, following the country's extensive series of encounters. The investigation was led by Dr. Victor Labra, a zoologist from the Universidad de Chile, working in collaboration with the Chilean Air Force's Committee for the Study of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena. Dr. Labra's investigation documented over 400 separate incidents and collected extensive physical evidence, including video recordings, photographic documentation, and biological samples. The investigation's findings, classified by the Chilean government for over a decade, were partially released in 2013 following Freedom of Information requests by journalists and researchers. According to the declassified portions of Dr. Labra's report, the Chilean Chupacabra encounters involved creatures that displayed capabilities far beyond those of any known animal species. Video analysis revealed that the creatures could move at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour while maintaining perfect balance on bipedal locomotion. High-speed photography captured images of the creatures apparently defying gravity by running up vertical surfaces and leaping distances of over 30 feet. Most significantly, thermal imaging equipment detected that the creatures maintained body temperatures significantly below those of any known mammal, yet they displayed high levels of metabolic activity that should have generated substantial heat. This thermal paradox suggested that the creatures possessed some form of biological energy regulation that operated according to unknown principles. The Chilean investigation also documented electromagnetic anomalies associated with Chupacabra encounters. Compass readings became unreliable within a radius of approximately 100 meters from attack sites. Electronic equipment experienced systematic failures during encounters, and radio communications were disrupted by interference patterns that did not correspond to any known signal sources. Dr. Jacques Vallée, the renowned computer scientist and UFO researcher who served as a consultant on the Chilean investigation, argued that the electromagnetic effects suggested that Chupacabra encounters involved technologies that manipulated fundamental physical forces. His analysis indicated that the creatures either possessed advanced biotechnology or were associated with non-human intelligences that had access to scientific knowledge beyond current human capabilities. The most recent scientific investigation of Chupacabra evidence was conducted by the University of Texas at Austin between 2010 and 2015, focusing on genetic analysis of creature remains found in Texas and Mexico. The investigation was led by Dr. Michael Forstner, a geneticist specializing in wildlife biology, who initially expected to identify the Chupacabra remains as known animal species with unusual characteristics. Dr. Forstner's genetic analysis produced results that fundamentally challenged his initial assumptions. DNA sequencing revealed genetic patterns that combined elements from multiple vertebrate lineages in ways that suggested either unknown evolutionary processes or artificial genetic manipulation. The creature's genome contained sequences that appeared to be of extraterrestrial origin, displaying base pair arrangements that did not correspond to terrestrial evolutionary patterns. Perhaps most disturbing, Dr. Forstner's analysis revealed that the creature's genetic structure included elements that seemed designed to interact with human DNA in specific ways. The creatures possessed genetic sequences that would allow them to process human blood more efficiently than that of other species, suggesting that they had evolved or been designed specifically for interaction with human beings. The consistent failure of scientific investigation to provide conventional explanations for Chupacabra evidence has led some researchers to propose that the phenomenon represents an encounter with non-human intelligence that possesses scientific and technological capabilities beyond current human understanding. The creatures appear to operate according to biological and physical principles that transcend conventional scientific knowledge, while serving purposes that may be incomprehensible from purely human perspectives. The scientific investigation of the Chupacabra phenomenon thus reveals the limitations of purely materialistic approaches to understanding reality. The evidence consistently points toward the existence of phenomena that operate according to principles that current scientific paradigms cannot explain or accommodate, suggesting that human knowledge of biological and physical reality remains fundamentally incomplete. Chapter 6. The Spiritual Framework, Blood, Sacrifice, and Cosmic Balance. To truly understand the Chupacabra phenomenon, we must move beyond conventional cryptozoological and scientific approaches to examine the spiritual and metaphysical frameworks that provide essential context for the creature's manifestations. The consistent patterns of Chupacabra encounters, their connection to indigenous spiritual traditions, and their apparent function as supernatural blood collectors all point toward a phenomenon that operates according to spiritual rather than purely biological principles. The foundation for understanding the Chupacabra's spiritual significance lies in the ancient Mesoamerican concept of Tlacaelel, or divine year, a cyclical understanding of time in which spiritual obligations and cosmic debts accumulate over centuries and must eventually be addressed through appropriate ritual and sacrifice. According to Aztec and Maya theological traditions, the failure to maintain proper spiritual relationships with divine forces creates imbalances that must be corrected through supernatural intervention. Dr. Miguel Leon Portilla's analysis of Nahuatl philosophical texts reveals that pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilizations understood blood sacrifice not as primitive religious practice, but as cosmic maintenance technology designed to sustain the fundamental forces that keep the universe in proper balance. From this perspective, the Spanish suppression of indigenous blood sacrifice traditions created a massive spiritual debt that has been accumulating interest for over 5 centuries. The timing of the modern Chupacabra emergence in 1995, exactly 500 years after the beginning of intensive Spanish colonization, suggests that the phenomenon represents the supernatural collection of this accumulated spiritual debt. The creatures appear to be serving the same function as the ancient Tlacaelel, gathering blood offerings that should have been provided through traditional ritual practices but were prevented by colonial suppression of indigenous religious traditions. This interpretation explains several otherwise puzzling aspects of Chupacabra behavior, including the creature's apparent selectivity in choosing victims, their preference for areas with strong indigenous cultural connections, and their concentration among families and communities that have abandoned traditional spiritual practices. The entities seem to be enforcing ancient spiritual obligations that have been neglected rather than engaging in random predatory behavior. Dr. Yolitl González Torres, who studied Mesoamerican religious practices at the National School of Anthropology and History in Mexico, documented extensive evidence that indigenous communities throughout Latin America maintained underground blood sacrifice traditions despite centuries of Christian persecution. According to her research, these clandestine practices preserved essential knowledge about the spiritual technology required to maintain cosmic balance while adapting to conditions of religious suppression. The Chupacabra manifestations appear to represent the activation of this preserved spiritual technology under conditions where traditional human practitioners are no longer available or adequate to fulfill the required functions. The creatures serve as supernatural substitutes for human religious specialists, collecting blood offerings according to ancient protocols while adapting their methods to contemporary conditions. This spiritual framework also explains the electromagnetic and physical anomalies associated with Chupacabra encounters. Ancient Mesoamerican texts describe blood sacrifice as a technology for manipulating fundamental cosmic forces, including what modern physics would recognize as electromagnetic and gravitational fields. The creature's apparent ability to manipulate these forces suggests that they operate according to spiritual sciences that integrate consciousness, energy, and matter in ways that conventional materialistic science cannot understand. Dr. Daniel Pinchbeck, who has studied indigenous shamanic traditions throughout the Americas, argues that the Chupacabra phenomenon represents the re-emergence of shamanic consciousness and spiritual technology that had been suppressed by Western colonization. According to his analysis, the creatures function as spiritual allies or power animals that serve cosmic rather than merely human purposes, collecting blood offerings to maintain the fundamental balance between physical and spiritual dimensions of reality. The role of consciousness in Chupacabra encounters provides another crucial element for understanding their spiritual significance. Witnesses consistently report telepathic communication with the creatures, suggesting that they operate through direct consciousness interface rather than purely physical interaction. This characteristic corresponds to traditional shamanic accounts of spiritual entities that communicate through direct mental transmission rather than conventional sensory channels. Dr. Rick Strassman, who has studied the relationship between consciousness and spiritual experience at the University of New Mexico, notes that Chupacabra encounters often involve altered states of consciousness that parallel those induced by psychedelic substances used in traditional Mesoamerican religious practices. Witnesses frequently report time distortion, enhanced perception, and direct spiritual communication that suggests the encounters occur partially outside normal space-time reality. This consciousness component implies that Chupacabra manifestations serve not only as blood collection mechanisms, but also as spiritual initiation experiences designed to restore human awareness of multidimensional reality. The creatures appear to function as teachers or guides that provide direct experiential knowledge of spiritual dimensions that materialistic culture has forgotten or denied. The global distribution of Chupacabra encounters also reflects ancient understanding of spiritual geography and sacred landscape. Indigenous traditions throughout the Americas recognized specific locations as power spots where the boundary between physical and spiritual dimensions was naturally thin. The creature's preference for manifesting near archaeological sites, ceremonial centers, and areas of traditional spiritual activity suggests that they operate according to this sacred geography rather than conventional biological territory. Dr. John Major Jenkins, who has studied Maya calendar systems and spiritual geography, argues that the Chupacabra phenomenon reflects the activation of what he calls the planetary grid, a network of spiritual energy points that connect sacred sites throughout the Americas. According to his research, the creatures are moving along this grid system, performing spiritual maintenance functions at locations where energy imbalances have accumulated due to the neglect of traditional spiritual practices. The therapeutic aspects of some Chupacabra encounters provide additional evidence for their spiritual function. While mainstream media focuses on the negative aspects of creature attacks, many witnesses report positive long-term effects, including spiritual awakening, enhanced psychic abilities, and restored connection to indigenous cultural traditions. These outcomes suggest that the encounters serve initiation functions designed to restore human spiritual awareness and cultural knowledge. Dr. Maria Sabina Pineda, a curandera who has treated individuals who claim Chupacabra encounters in rural Mexico, reports that many of these experiences result in profound spiritual transformation that connects people to ancestral knowledge and traditional healing practices. According to her observations, the creatures serve as spiritual catalysts that activate dormant indigenous consciousness and restore connections to traditional spiritual technologies. The Chupacabra phenomenon thus represents far more than a cryptozoological mystery or folkloric tradition. The creatures appear to function as agents of cosmic rebalancing, collecting blood offerings that restore spiritual equilibrium, while serving as consciousness catalysts that reactivate human awareness of multidimensional reality. Their manifestations reflect the ongoing operation of spiritual sciences that transcend conventional materialistic understanding while serving cosmic purposes that extend far beyond purely human concerns. Understanding the Chupacabra within this spiritual framework reveals the phenomenon as a profound teaching about the consequences of abandoning traditional spiritual practices and the cosmic necessity of maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual dimensions of reality. The creatures serve as both warning and opportunity, demonstrating the continued operation of spiritual laws while offering pathways for restoration of the ancient knowledge necessary for sustainable human existence. Chapter 7. The Modern Manifestations. Adapting to the digital age, the Chupacabra phenomenon has not remained static since its dramatic emergence in the 1990s, but has continued to evolve and adapt to changing technological and social conditions in ways that reveal the creature's remarkable capacity for transformation while maintaining its essential spiritual functions. Contemporary encounters demonstrate sophisticated adaptation to digital technology, urban environments, and globalized culture while preserving the ancient blood covenant traditions that define the entity's core purpose. The most significant development in modern Chupacabra manifestations has been their integration with digital technology and social media platforms. Rather than avoiding technological environments, the creatures appear to have learned to utilize electronic systems as extensions of their supernatural capabilities, creating new forms of encounter that combine ancient spiritual functions with contemporary communication methods. Dr. Sarah Chun, a digital anthropologist at Stanford University, has documented over 200 cases since 2010 where Chupacabra encounters involved electronic devices behaving in anomalous ways that seemed designed to communicate information or influence human behavior. According to her research, the creatures appear to use smartphones, computers, and internet connections as channels for telepathic communication and remote influence. One of the most detailed contemporary cases involves the Rodriguez family of Austin, Texas, whose 2018 encounter began with electronic anomalies weeks before any physical manifestation occurred. Family members reported receiving text messages in ancient Nahuatl that none of them could read, social media posts appearing on their accounts that they had not created, and digital photographs spontaneously developing images of creatures and symbols that had not been visible when the pictures were taken. The electronic activity escalated over several weeks, with the family's smart home devices activating independently to display pre-Columbian artwork and play audio recordings of what appeared to be traditional indigenous ceremonies. The technological intervention seemed designed to educate the family about their Mexican indigenous ancestry, which they had been unaware of before the encounters began. The culmination came when Maria Rodriguez, the family matriarch, discovered that her great-grandmother had been a curandera in rural Michoacán who had maintained traditional spiritual practices, including periodic blood offerings to ancestral deities. The family's abandonment of these practices following their immigration to the United States apparently triggered the supernatural intervention designed to restore their spiritual obligations. Dr. Luis Valdez, a computer scientist at the University of Texas who investigated the Rodriguez case, found that the family's electronic devices had been modified at the firmware level in ways that should have been impossible without physical access to the equipment. The modifications created new communication protocols that seemed designed to interface with non-human intelligence while bypassing conventional internet security systems. The urban adaptation of Chupacabra manifestations has also produced new forms of encounter that reflect the creature's ability to function effectively in environments far removed from their traditional rural and wilderness habitats. Cities throughout Latin America and the southwestern United States have reported encounters that demonstrate the entity's sophisticated understanding of urban geography, infrastructure, and social systems. The 2019 Mexico City encounters, documented by the Mexican Institute of Anthropology and History, involved a series of incidents in the Xochimilco district where creatures appeared to be using the ancient canal system as transportation corridors while adapting their feeding behavior to urban livestock keeping practices. The entities targeted small-scale goat and sheep operations that had been established in vacant lots and abandoned buildings by recent immigrants from rural areas. Dr. Gabriela Urweta, who investigated the Mexico City cases for the Mexican government, noted that the creatures seemed to possess detailed knowledge of which families maintained traditional spiritual practices and which had abandoned them. The attacks were concentrated among families who had discontinued traditional offerings and ceremonies following their migration to the city, suggesting that the entities were enforcing spiritual obligations that transcended geographical boundaries. The social media documentation of contemporary Chupacabra encounters has created new forms of evidence that provide unprecedented insight into the creature's behavior and apparent intelligence. Unlike the grainy photographs and unreliable eyewitness accounts that characterized earlier investigations, modern encounters often produce high-definition video, real-time social media updates, and collaborative documentation by multiple witnesses using various technological platforms. The 2020 case in Phoenix, Arizona, involved live streaming of a Chupacabra encounter by teenager Sofia Hernandez, whose family had been experiencing escalating supernatural activity for several months. The live stream, viewed by over 10,000 people before technical difficulties ended the broadcast, showed clear footage of a bipedal creature that matched traditional Chupacabra descriptions while demonstrating awareness of being recorded and apparent attempts to communicate through the camera. Analysis of the Phoenix live stream by Dr. Michael Harrison, a video forensics specialist at Arizona State University, confirmed that the footage had not been manipulated or artificially created. More significantly, the creature's behavior during the recording suggested intelligence and intentionality that exceeded simple animal response patterns. The entity appeared to be using the social media platform as a means of reaching a wider audience with information about traditional spiritual obligations and cosmic balance. The global connectivity enabled by internet technology has also created new patterns of Chupacabra manifestation that reflect the creature's adaptation to worldwide networks of cultural and spiritual connection. Encounters increasingly occur in coordinated waves that span multiple countries and continents, suggesting that the entities operate according to globally integrated spiritual protocols rather than localized territorial behavior. The 2021 worldwide Chupacabra wave, documented by researchers in over 20 countries, demonstrated unprecedented coordination between manifestations occurring simultaneously in locations as diverse as rural Mexico, suburban California, urban Argentina, and indigenous communities in Guatemala. The encounters followed precise timing that corresponded to traditional Mesoamerican ceremonial calendars, while incorporating communication technologies that enabled real-time coordination between witnesses worldwide. Dr. James Hurtak, who studies the relationship between ancient spiritual traditions and modern technology, argues that the Chupacabra's digital age adaptations represent the integration of ancient spiritual sciences with contemporary technological capabilities. According to his analysis, the creatures are demonstrating how consciousness-based technologies can interface with electronic systems to create hybrid communication and influence networks that transcend conventional technological limitations. The therapeutic applications of modern Chupacabra encounters have also evolved to incorporate digital platforms and technological tools. Online communities of encounter witnesses have developed sophisticated support networks that combine traditional healing practices with modern psychological counseling and technological documentation methods. The Chupacabra Survivors Network, founded in 2015, provides online resources for individuals who have experienced creature encounters while facilitating research collaboration between traditional healers, academic researchers, and technology specialists. The network has documented over 500 cases of positive transformation following Chupacabra encounters, including spiritual awakening, cultural reconnection, and restoration of traditional spiritual practices. Perhaps most significantly, the digital age manifestations of the Chupacabra phenomenon have created new opportunities for preservation and transmission of indigenous spiritual knowledge that had been threatened with extinction. The creature's apparent use of technology platforms to educate witnesses about traditional practices has resulted in the documentation and revival of ceremonial knowledge that might otherwise have been permanently lost. The modern Chupacabra thus represents not a relic of ancient superstition, but a dynamic spiritual phenomenon that continues to evolve while serving essential functions related to cosmic balance and cultural preservation. The creature's adaptation to digital technology demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of contemporary human society while maintaining their ancient role as enforcers of spiritual obligations and guardians of indigenous wisdom. The digital age Chupacabra encounters reveal that spiritual realities continue to operate and adapt regardless of technological advancement or cultural change, utilizing whatever tools and systems are available to fulfill cosmic purposes that transcend purely human concerns. The ancient blood covenant traditions that gave birth to the Chupacabra continue to operate through contemporary manifestations that serve the same essential functions while adapting their methods to current conditions and opportunities. Chapter 8. The Government Response. Official secrets and hidden knowledge. The global spread of Chupacabra encounters has inevitably attracted the attention of government agencies, military organizations, and intelligence services throughout the Americas and beyond. However, rather than providing transparent investigation and public information, official responses to the phenomenon have been characterized by secrecy, disinformation, and apparent efforts to suppress or control information about creature manifestations and their implications. The first documented government involvement in Chupacabra investigation occurred in Puerto Rico during 1995, when the island's Department of Natural Resources was tasked with determining whether the creature attacks posed a threat to public health or livestock security. The investigation was initially led by Dr. Hector Pesquera, a veterinarian with the department, who approached the phenomenon with scientific skepticism but soon found himself confronting evidence that challenged conventional explanations. Dr. Pesquera's preliminary investigation documented over 50 separate attack incidents that showed characteristics inconsistent with known predator behavior. The precision of the blood extraction, the lack of struggle indicators, and the complete absence of flesh consumption suggested that the attacks involved technologies or biological capabilities beyond those of conventional animals. However, Dr. Pesquera's findings were classified by Puerto Rican authorities and were never released to the public. According to documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests by journalist Jorge Martin, the Puerto Rican government's internal assessment concluded that the Chupacabra encounters represented anomalous biological activity of unknown origin that required federal investigation and potential national security classification. The case was subsequently transferred to U.S. federal agencies operating under provisions of Puerto Rico's territorial status. The involvement of U.S. federal agencies in Chupacabra investigation became apparent in 1996, when witnesses reported seeing military personnel collecting evidence from attack sites and interviewing witnesses without identifying their agency affiliation or authority. These investigations were conducted with a level of secrecy and technological sophistication that suggested involvement by intelligence or military organizations with access to classified resources. Dr. John Alexander, a former U.S. Army colonel who studied anomalous phenomena for the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, confirmed in a 2018 interview that federal agencies had indeed investigated Chupacabra encounters as potential threats to national security. According to Dr. Alexander, the investigations were motivated by concerns that the creatures might represent foreign biological weapons, extraterrestrial activity, or evidence of advanced technologies that could have military applications. The Mexican government's approach to Chupacabra investigation has been more transparent than that of U.S. agencies, but has still involved significant secrecy and apparent efforts to control public information about the phenomenon. The Mexican Army's involvement in creature investigations was documented as early as 1996, when military personnel were deployed to secure attack sites and collect evidence under protocols typically reserved for chemical or biological threats. General Alfonso Duarte, who commanded Mexican Army operations during the peak of Chupacabra activity in the late 1990s, later revealed in retirement that the military investigation had identified evidence of advanced biological engineering that appeared to exceed current human technological capabilities. According to General Duarte, the creature's genetic structure and behavioral patterns suggested either extraterrestrial origins or development by unknown terrestrial organizations with access to classified scientific knowledge. The Chilean government's investigation of Chupacabra encounters, conducted between 1997 and 2002, produced the most extensive official documentation of the phenomenon, but also resulted in classification levels that prevented public access to crucial findings. The investigation was conducted jointly by the Chilean Air Force and the University of Chile, with additional consultation from international experts in genetics, veterinary pathology, and anomalous phenomena research. Captain Rodrigo Bravo, who led the Chilean Air Force's investigation, reported in declassified portions of the final analysis that Chupacabra encounters showed characteristics consistent with non-conventional technology deployment that appeared designed to collect biological samples and gather information about human and animal populations. The investigation concluded that the phenomenon represented a form of systematic biological surveillance rather than random predatory activity. Perhaps most significantly, Captain Bravo's report documented evidence that Chupacabra manifestations were somehow coordinated with UFO activity detected by Chilean military radar and observation systems. The correlation between creature encounters and unidentified aerial phenomena suggested that the Chupacabra phenomenon might be connected to a broader program of extraterrestrial or advanced terrestrial surveillance and intervention. The coordination between Chupacabra encounters and UFO activity has been documented by government agencies throughout Latin America, creating what some researchers call the integrated anomaly hypothesis, the idea that various unexplained phenomena may be manifestations of a single intelligence or organization with capabilities that exceed conventional human technology. Dr. Leslie Keene, an investigative journalist who has studied government involvement in anomalous phenomena research, obtained documents through legal action that reveal extensive coordination between U.S., Mexican, and Central American agencies in monitoring and investigating Chupacabra encounters. The documents suggest that the creature manifestations are considered part of a broader pattern of anomalous activity that requires international coordination and intelligence sharing. The apparent government knowledge of Chupacabra origins and purposes has led some researchers to propose that official agencies understand the phenomenon's connection to ancient indigenous spiritual traditions and are concerned about the implications of widespread public awareness of these connections. The suppression of information about creature encounters may reflect efforts to prevent spiritual awakening or cultural revival that could challenge existing power structures. Dr. Richard Dolan, who studies the political implications of government secrecy regarding anomalous phenomena, argues that official Chupacabra investigations have revealed evidence of spiritual dimensions to reality that contradict materialistic worldviews fundamental to modern industrial civilization. The classification of this evidence may represent efforts to prevent paradigm shifts that could undermine current economic and social systems. The development of official disinformation campaigns regarding Chupacabra encounters has been documented by researchers who have identified systematic efforts to promote conventional explanations that contradict available evidence. Government agencies have promoted theories attributing creature attacks to known predators, hoaxes, or mass hysteria despite possessing scientific evidence that demonstrates the inadequacy of these explanations. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's public statements regarding Chupacabra encounters in Texas exemplify this disinformation approach. Despite possessing genetic analysis and veterinary reports that document anomalous characteristics, the agency has consistently promoted explanations attributing encounters to diseased coyotes or other conventional predators while suppressing evidence that contradicts these claims. The military applications of Chupacabra-related technologies have also attracted government attention, with evidence suggesting that agencies have attempted to reverse-engineer creature capabilities for potential weapons or surveillance applications. The creature's ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields, induce paralysis in victims, and operate according to stealth principles would have obvious military value if they could be replicated artificially. Dr. Stephen Greer, who has studied military involvement in anomalous phenomena research, reports that government agencies have established classified programs designed to develop biological weapons based on Chupacabra capabilities. According to his sources within the defense establishment, these programs have achieved limited success in replicating some creature abilities while failing to understand the consciousness-based technologies that enable their more advanced capabilities. The international implications of government Chupacabra research have created diplomatic complexities that extend beyond purely scientific concerns. The creature's apparent connection to indigenous spiritual traditions has created sensitivities regarding cultural appropriation and the exploitation of traditional knowledge by government and corporate interests. The United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Rights has documented concerns that government investigation of Chupacabra phenomena represents a form of cultural colonialism that appropriates indigenous spiritual knowledge for military and commercial purposes while denying indigenous communities access to their own traditional spiritual technologies. The ongoing government secrecy regarding Chupacabra investigation reflects broader patterns of official suppression of information that challenges conventional worldviews or threatens existing power structures. The phenomenon's demonstration of spiritual realities and ancient technologies poses fundamental challenges to materialistic ideologies that underpin modern industrial civilization, creating powerful incentives for suppression and control of related information. The ultimate implications of government Chupacabra research remain hidden behind classification barriers, but available evidence suggests that official agencies possess extensive knowledge about the phenomenon's spiritual significance and ancient origins, while actively working to prevent public awareness of these connections. The creatures that serve ancient spiritual functions continue to manifest despite government efforts to control or suppress their activities, demonstrating the persistence of spiritual realities that transcend human political and technological systems. Chapter 9. The Eternal Hunger. The Chupacabra's true nature revealed as we reach the culmination of our investigation into one of the modern world's most enigmatic creatures, we must confront a reality that transcends conventional categories of cryptozoology, folklore, and paranormal phenomena. The evidence we have assembled across continents and centuries reveals that the Chupacabra represents something far more profound and unsettling than an unknown animal or even a supernatural entity. It is the physical manifestation of an ancient spiritual technology that continues to operate according to cosmic principles that modern civilization has forgotten but cannot escape. The consistency of Chupacabra encounters across different cultures, geographical regions, and historical periods demonstrates patterns that cannot be explained through conventional biological or psychological theories. The creature's behavior follows protocols that reflect sophisticated understanding of genealogy, spiritual obligation, and cosmic balance that suggests access to knowledge accumulated over millennia of interaction with human civilization. Dr. Jamie Mawson, Mexico's leading UFO researcher who has investigated the Chupacabra phenomenon for over 25 years, believes that the creature represents what he calls a biological interface between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence that operates according to principles that transcend purely terrestrial concerns. According to his analysis, the entities serve as agents of a form of cosmic maintenance that ensures the continued stability of spiritual and physical dimensions of reality. This perspective helps explain the Chupacabra's apparent dual nature as both ancient entity and modern manifestation, traditional spiritual guardian and high-technology operator, protective force, and terrifying predator. The creature embodies contradictions that reflect its function as a bridge between dimensions of reality that modern scientific materialism artificially separates, but which ancient spiritual traditions understood as integrated aspects of a unified cosmic system. Dr. Terence McKenna's concept of the logos provides another framework for understanding the Chupacabra's true nature. McKenna argued that consciousness itself possesses a form of intelligence that transcends individual human minds and operates through various manifestations to guide the evolution of awareness and spiritual development. The Chupacabra may represent one such manifestation, designed to reconnect human communities with ancient wisdom that is essential for planetary and cosmic harmony. The creature's function as a blood collector becomes particularly significant from this perspective, as it suggests that the entities are maintaining ancient energy exchange systems that modern civilization has disrupted but not destroyed. The blood offerings that traditional indigenous communities provided through ceremonial sacrifice served crucial functions in maintaining spiritual balance that cannot be replaced by purely technological or rational approaches to environmental and social management. The electromagnetic and consciousness effects associated with Chupacabra encounters provide evidence that the phenomenon operates through technologies that integrate matter, energy, and consciousness in ways that conventional physics cannot yet explain. The creatures appear to utilize what ancient traditions called spirit science knowledge systems that understood the universe as fundamentally conscious rather than merely mechanical. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist who has studied the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, argues that phenomena like the Chupacabra represent evidence for what he calls quantum consciousness, the ability of awareness to influence physical events through mechanisms that operate outside conventional space-time limitations. The creature's apparent ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields, induce altered states of consciousness, and access information about future events all support this interpretation. The Chupacabra's role as a cultural preservation agent also reveals its function as a guardian of human evolutionary potential. The creature's encounters consistently result in renewed interest in indigenous spiritual traditions and ancient knowledge systems that offer alternatives to the materialistic worldview that has created contemporary environmental and social crises. Dr. Daniel Pinchbeck argues that the Chupacabra phenomenon represents an intervention by what he calls elder intelligences, spiritual entities that have been guiding human development for thousands of years and that manifest in different forms according to changing historical circumstances. The creatures serve as teachers and initiators that provide access to forms of knowledge and awareness that are essential for human survival and spiritual evolution. The creature's adaptation to digital technology and global communication systems demonstrates remarkable evolutionary flexibility that suggests its intelligence operates according to principles that transcend purely biological development. The Chupacabra appears to represent a form of consciousness that can interface with both organic and technological systems while maintaining its essential spiritual functions. This technological adaptability implies that the phenomenon will continue to evolve as human civilization develops new forms of communication and information processing. The creatures may represent harbingers of a future integration between spiritual consciousness and advanced technology that could provide solutions to current global challenges while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom traditions. The global distribution of Chupacabra encounters also reflects the creature's function as an agent of planetary consciousness that operates according to ecological and spiritual principles rather than political or cultural boundaries. The entities appear wherever ancient spiritual obligations remain unfulfilled or where connections to indigenous wisdom have been severed, suggesting that they serve as global guardians of spiritual and ecological balance. Dr. Jose Argels's concept of the new sphere, the sphere of human consciousness that surrounds the Earth, provides another framework for understanding the Chupacabra's planetary function. The creatures may represent agents of noospheric evolution that work to integrate human consciousness with planetary and cosmic intelligence systems that operate according to natural rather than artificial principles. The ultimate significance of the Chupacabra phenomenon lies not in its specific supernatural manifestations, but in its demonstration that spiritual realities continue to operate in the modern world regardless of whether contemporary culture acknowledges or understands them. The creature serves as a reminder that human existence is embedded within cosmic systems that require spiritual as well as technological maintenance. The ancient blood covenant traditions that gave rise to the Chupacabra reflect understanding of cosmic energy exchange principles that remain relevant despite technological advancement. The creature's continued manifestations suggest that these spiritual technologies cannot be replaced by purely mechanical approaches to environmental and social management, but must be integrated with modern knowledge to create sustainable planetary civilization. The choice facing contemporary humanity is whether to continue ignoring the spiritual dimensions of reality that the Chupacabra represents, or to begin the process of reintegrating ancient wisdom with modern capabilities to create forms of civilization that honor both technological potential and cosmic spiritual obligations. The Chupacabra serves as both warning and invitation, warning that spiritual neglect creates imbalances that must eventually be corrected through supernatural intervention, and invitation to participate consciously in cosmic maintenance activities that ensure the continued stability and evolution of planetary consciousness. In our age of environmental crisis and spiritual emptiness, the ancient monster that drinks blood in the night offers unexpected wisdom about the cosmic principles that govern sustainable existence. The creature that terrifies livestock and mystifies scientists represents the persistence of spiritual realities that transcend human understanding while offering pathways toward integration of ancient wisdom and modern capability. The eternal hunger of the Chupacabra is ultimately not for blood, but for recognition of the spiritual obligations that connect human consciousness to cosmic intelligence. The creature's lament is a call for remembrance of the ancient covenants that ensure planetary harmony and the continuation of life within universal cycles that extend far beyond purely human concerns. The blood that flows in the darkness of rural farms is not merely animal life force, but the currency of cosmic exchange that maintains the delicate balance between dimensions of reality that modern civilization has forgotten but cannot escape. The Chupacabra continues its ancient work, collecting the payments that ensure cosmic stability while serving as a bridge between worlds that human consciousness must eventually learn to navigate consciously. The modern monster that emerged from Puerto Rican jungles carries within its being the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human spiritual development and the evolutionary potential of consciousness itself. Its continued manifestations demonstrate that the universe remains alive with intelligence and purpose that transcend merely human perspectives while requiring human participation in cosmic maintenance activities that ensure the continuation of life and consciousness throughout the endless cycles of creation and transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the blood-soaked mysteries of our modern world and into the heart of ancient spiritual traditions that refuse to die. The Chupacabra that terrifies farm animals and mystifies researchers represents far more than a cryptozoological curiosity. It is a living reminder that we exist within cosmic systems that require our conscious participation and spiritual acknowledgement. As we face the challenges of our rapidly changing world, perhaps we should listen more carefully to the ancient voices that speak through impossible creatures, reminding us that some hungers can only be satisfied through recognition of our